I'd like to turn it over to our next speaker now, who is Pedro Pizarro, the CEO of Edison International. Maybe he can address why the partnership that Kristen was just talking about for GM was with PG&E and not with Southern California Edison. But Pedro, it's good to see you again. Welcome, welcome back to Caltech, and the floor is yours.
It's great seeing you, Neil. Thanks a lot. And we are actually doing some things with GM and Ford and everybody. It's an important ecosystem, so it's great to follow Kristen here. Hey, I want to say thanks to you and to Harry and Bert, folks, for inviting me. It's really glad to be here, and I feel like I'm here with two different hats on. One is my industry hat, electric sector hat, but the other one always has to be my Caltech hat. I'm just proud to be on the board of trustees, and so it's great to be part of this discussion. And I thought what I would do is start my remarks and by focusing on context from California. You know, most of our operations are here for our company. For those of you who don't know, it's Edison International, parent to Southern California Edison, our utility here, as well as Edison Energy, which is providing advisory services to a lot of the Fortune 100 nationally and globally, including in areas like transportation, electrification, and sustainability. But let me focus on California and start with history here, which probably most folks know, but it's important to recap. In 2016, the state passed and signed into law SB 32, and that required us to reduce the entire state, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions economy-wide by 40% from 1990 levels by 2030. Tick-tock, that's 8 years away, right? After that, in 2018, state passed SB 100, requiring retail electricity sales to be carbon-free by 2045. It's also an executive order for carbon neutrality by 2045. And so at Edison, we've been looking intensively at this. I became CEO in 2016, and at that point, we started investing in developing a point of view on not just our sector, but how the entire California economy could get to net zero in the most affordable and reliable way. Now, we're also interested in national analysis, but it's interesting to look at the California level because the state is more advanced in its climate goals, targets, and progress. And frankly, because the economic impact on the rest of the country is very large. So what we're doing here can serve as a blueprint for the whole nation and more globally. If California were an independent country, it would be the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world, depending on whatever the exchange rate is that day on the dollar. And so that's larger than countries like India, France, and Italy. I'm also on the board of the Electric Power Research Institute, and EPRI has been doing a lot of work on the national level in terms of analysis, including full Sankey diagrams. And I was glad to be able to connect Bert with some of the folks there. The approach we've taken in all of these analyses is to not just look at the power sector, but to look at the whole economy. And so I want to share some perspectives from both of these analyses, starting with Edison's work on California. We've published a number of policy papers on this, and by the way, if you're interested, they're available on our website at edison.com. But essentially, we've used an economy-wide greenhouse gas reduction model to build a supply curve of carbon abatement options economy-wide, and then establish feasible and affordable paths to decarbonize the economy across all sectors. We then used electric sector specific models to understand further how the electric grid will need to evolve to enable that decarbonization. Our first paper was published in 2017 by Southern California Edison. It focused on the state's 2030 GHG targets. And then we extended that work to 2045 net zero and published another paper called Pathway 2045, and that was published in 2019. The punchline of that paper was that the state can't get to net zero at a macro level by 2045 with remaining emissions at 108 million metric tons a year that would need to be captured in some way. We saw that being the more economic approach to still rely on negative carbon tools, whether it's natural or working lands or some form of engineered carbon capture and sequestration. Now, interestingly, since our analysis, state entities have also been working on analysis on their own. And recently, the California Air Resources Board estimated about 100 million metric tons needing capture in 2045 in their draft 2022 scoping plan. So it's good to see that these models are all coming up with similar approaches. Now, for the rest of the 450 million tons or so that exist today, so 450 minus 108, call it 100. So the other 350 million tons or so of emissions that need to be abated, we looked at a number of alternatives across fuel classes. And we ended up with three scenarios. One that was more electricity heavy, one that had more biofuels, such as biomethane in it, and one that was more hydrogen heavy. And we found that the electricity heavy approach was feasible and more affordable given where technologies are today and how they will likely evolve. And additionally, we ensured that grid delivered retail electricity in 25 is carbon free to comply with the state law. However, between wholesale generation and retail generation, you have about 7% losses that under current law, you can still use. It would not necessarily be fully carbon free and still have to stay be at net zero. Well, we found that using those losses to allow some headroom for some remaining carbon emissions in the electric system, so approximately 6% of generation in 2045 still coming from natural gas, that had a significant beneficial impact in terms of reliability and affordability. And one way to think about it is that the cost of that last carbon molecule you remove from the power sector is so expensive that if you're really optimizing economy-wide, you're better off allowing that little bit of carbon to remain at the wholesale level and instead investing those dollars in reducing carbon emissions that may have a bigger impact in other sectors, like spending them on an electric vehicle or a heat pump. And so that's one of the fundamental premises of our analysis, that economy-wide optimization ends up with, a better answer for the whole state. So you've got lots of renewables, carbon-free resources such as large hydro and nuclear, and a lot of storage. And so that means that there's variability of renewable generation that has been managed by these resources. With the numbers in our analysis, we saw additions of 80 gigawatts of bulk power renewables and 30 gigawatts of distributed renewables, balanced by adding 30 gigawatts of bulk storage and 10 gigawatts of distributed storage, all of this by 2045 on a statewide basis. That's a lot of investment. And so we estimated that's about $175 billion statewide for the renewables and storage piece, and requiring another $75 billion to invest in the grid to interconnect all of these resources. So that's the supply side of our analysis. You then take all that supply, all that clean electricity, and when you go to the demand side, you use it to electrify most of the economy, but not all. So we see that by 2045, 3/4 of passenger vehicles would be electric, 1/3 of heavy duty, 2/3 of medium duty vehicles will also be electric. As you go up into the heavier duty transportation classes, it is harder to electrify those. And although we still see, again, about 1/3 of the heaviest duty vehicles being electric, the remaining vehicles will be powered by hydrogen and biofuels. Now let's talk about another part of the demand side that's important, and that's buildings. And we see 70% of space and water heating in buildings needing to end up being electric by 2045. Now that gets us most of the way there, but we also need other tools across the economy. I mentioned hard to electrify applications like long haul transport or very heat intensive industrial processes. So we see needing clean fuels for those, like hydrogen from electrolysis, not from methanation. So there's additional things we can do there to fill the gap that electricity can't fill. Now, one of the other pieces in the analysis is increasing energy efficiency. And from an economics perspective, that gives you the lowest cost approach to getting to net zero. That's the lowest cost tranche in the supply curve. Now, interestingly, from an affordability perspective, which we worry a lot about, right? A third of our residential customers at SCE qualify for low income assistance, for example. So that affordability piece is really important for the average consumer. And one of the pieces of the analysis that frankly surprised me, I didn't expect it, but when you think about it, it does make sense. We saw that the average electric customer in 2045 will see their rates go up, right? Because we'll be making all these investments in the grid. Their electric bill will go up because they will be spending or using more electricity as they shift use from gasoline or natural gas to electricity. But when you add up their total energy bill, electricity, natural gas, gasoline, that total bill will be 1/3 lower in real terms than it is today. And that's because the electric technologies that we're deploying are so much more efficient from a physics perspective of the work in versus the energy in versus the work out. So that means that there's economic value to be captured with all of these initial investments after we make all these initial investments in the grid and in electrifying so much of the economy. Now, again, this is a California perspective for meeting carbon neutrality in 2045. But getting to 2045 won't be possible unless we start making significant progress now against the 2030 goals. So at the end of last year, Edison International published another policy paper that we called Mind the Gap. And that looked at California and the progress towards the legislative target of that 40% reduction by 2030. And what we found there was that there is a gap, right? The state is running short if you look at current state policies and business as usual activities. So we believe that relative to where the state needs to land in 2030, right now we're running about 30 to 90 million tons short economy-wide of that goal. So when you translate that into simpler terms, the state's been reducing greenhouse gas emissions by about 1% a year economy-wide for the last decade or so. And that's actually, terrific work, because the economy has also been growing by about 3% a year. So 1% reduction with 3% economy-wide growth, is job well done. Unfortunately, there's a catch, and that's that to get to the 2030 mark, the state is going to need to quadruple the rate of emission reduction from 1% to 4% per year, beginning basically now. And so that's a really big jump for the state to make in the next 8 years. And in our Mind the Gap paper, which we released right before we went to the Glasgow COP26 conference, we included several recommendations in it in order to push on the sectors that need the most help to help close that gap. So let's work with the low end of the range and assume that we're dealing with a 30 million ton gap. Well, we see that about 10% of that gap, 3 million tons, needs to be closed by increasing the deployment of renewables and storage. Those areas are coming along reasonably well. To be qualitative about it, they need just a nice little push, but they're generally on track. Now, in aggregate, while greenhouse gas emissions have been decreasing in recent years due to the increasing share of renewable power, transportation emissions have actually increased since 2013, and they remain the state's biggest decarbonization challenge. Today, transportation produces about half of California's GHG emissions, and that's both in the direct tailpipe emissions as well as the upstream refinery emissions. So our analysis at Edison showed that for a sector that's contributing half of the emissions, it also comprises about 1/3 of the emissions gap that we see for 2030, assuming that existing policies continue and that funding is provided for those. So that means that there's additional work, additional policies, additional incentives that we need to help speed up the deployment of vehicles, things like speeding up the deployment of charging. And clearly the OEM community, as we heard from Kristen, is working on providing the supply of vehicles for the public. Now, I will say, though, that for a sector that's contributing 50%, being about 1/3 of the gap, that's not so bad. Buildings are another story. So buildings today are about 10% of emissions statewide. However, we see that they account for a full 25% of the gap. So buildings, 10% of emissions, but they really need to be goosed up. That they need the big kick in terms of support, because they contribute 1/4 of the 2030 gap. Last December, Southern California Edison presented a new plan to the California Public Utilities Commission that would provide over $670 million for programs to help accelerate the growth of building electrification over the next 4 years. And if approved, that plan would get 250,000 heat pumps deployed, again, in about a 4-year period. Now, that program is interesting because, to be very candid with you, the cost benefit of it is right around 1. So it's a push. And that's because the market today is still fairly immature. The technologies for heat pumps work. The costs are still high. And one of the biggest challenges is the information gap. Many contractors don't really understand the technologies yet. So our purpose in filing this is to try to accelerate deployment and start bringing the cost curve down. Similarly to how the earliest renewables policies help bring down solar costs by about a factor of 7 today from where they started a couple decades ago. Earlier this year, the California Energy Commission issued a report in which it recommends installing at least 6 million heat pumps statewide by 2030. And although that goes aligned with our pathway vision, it doesn't cover the full gap. Additionally, the governor included another $1 billion in his state budget proposal to further heat pump deployment. So all of these actions are needed to jumpstart decarbonization of buildings. Now, that's just a California perspective. So let me turn briefly to the national perspective before I wrap up for questions. Let me turn to the work that EPRI is doing. Going back to 2018, they did a national electrification assessment that did not assume any new policies at the federal or state levels. So with existing policies on decarbonization and the expected progression in underlying technology costs, the analysis suggested that we would see some large increases in electrification, again, cars, buildings, and that would contribute something like a 30% further reduction in emissions versus business as usual by 2050. So that's almost like a do nothing or business as usual case. This was still during the Trump administration. It was before President Biden's nationally determined contribution goal of 50 to 52% economy-wide emissions reductions by 2030. But that's showed, how much potential there is even without new policy. Now, since then, EPRI launched a low carbon resources initiative working with the Gas Technology Institute on a research vision to accelerate the development and demonstration of low carbon energy technologies. It's a 5-year initiative. It's focused on large scale deployment to 2030 and beyond. Today, it has backing by more than $100 million in funding from about 40 sponsors, including our company. And that's going to provide a further updated assessment of the decarbonization potential across a number of research categories, including hydrocarbon-based processes, hydrogen, and end uses as well. Now, these research areas are a great opportunity for the electric and gas industries to commercialize and deploy low carbon energy carriers and fuels. And so we need to figure out how to support their production, transport, storage, utilization. Now, moving back to the bigger picture, in the US, the power sector, the electric power sector has achieved a lot of our greenhouse gas reductions nationally, primarily by taking coal plants out and replacing them with gas. And that's been an economic decision for those companies and their customers. Now, what I'm concerned about is that California, which is ahead of the nation in terms of decarbonization, is still behind on being able to meet its 2030 targets. So as you look at the national level progress, we're so far behind that unless there's a massive change of at least a 3x or 4x over the next 8 years, I don't see how the country is going to be able to make the NDC. We'll probably miss the NDC by probably 10 to 20%. So the question is, what can we do to accelerate that? And what's necessary to make that happen? Bert and I were talking last month, and he asked me why there isn't more of a Manhattan Project for this, and what would it take to get it started? So, clearly part of the answer is, frankly, all of you, and what the work that Caltech and Stanford are doing, the work that the national labs are doing right now on future technologies, areas like renewables and battery storage. So I think we have the basic technologies, but we need continued improvement, and we need faster deployment of those. And that's going to be across the whole business system. Renewables supply, battery storage, grid scale and behind the meter, for those, electric cars, heat pumps, and other applications. Let me close by talking a bit about the reality that technology is one thing, but politics and policies are another. And so we've been very engaged, both as a company and as an industry, with the Biden administration. I was fortunate to be invited to visit with the president a couple of months ago with a few other of my CEO peers in the industry. We've been engaged with Secretary Granholm, with Gina McCarthy at the White House as a climate advisor. And we've been supportive of the president's idea of getting more in legislation to support the transition. Unfortunately, we see bipartisan support lacking in Washington today to enact all the policies. And in addition, we now have a big supply chain challenge. And so on top of that, we had the Department of Commerce auction inquiry that basically froze the solar market in the US. Fortunately, President Biden provided a 2-year reprieve last week, but even that could be challenged in court. So there's that backdrop. With that, what would it take to get close to 50%? Well, we see on the electric generation side, in aggregate, we would need that to be about 70 to 80% carbon free by 2030. But again, that would need to be part of an economy-wide approach. Now, the carbon emissions from investor-owned utilities today are at their lowest level in nearly 40 years. and about 40% of the nation's electricity now comes from carbon-free sources. I'm vice chair of the Edison Electric Institute. It's the trade group that represents investor-owned utilities. We cover about 70% of the country. And most of our members have net zero commitments by 2045 or 2050. My own company has a net zero commitment by 2045 across scopes 1, 2, and 3. And so that's part of the answer. But we need to continue to get Washington support, things like clean energy tax credits, which is one of the remnants of the Build Back Better legislation that seems to be getting some play in Washington. And that's important because it can help decrease the cost for consumers of the clean energy transition. We also see the need for further support for electric vehicle deployment through tax credits, and similarly for building electrification through standards. And we see the work that the Department of Energy is doing with its Energy Earthshots initiative to help on the hydrogen side, with the target for a cost of clean hydrogen of reduction of 80% down to $1 per kilogram in the next decade. So all of those will be tools that might help us get close to the 50 to 52% NDC. So we're going to need technology work. We're going to need supporting policy work, and importantly, we're going to need the continued engagement of the broad academic community with industry, with government, to make all this happen. We also need support from federal, state, and local levels to reform permitting processes. Today, it takes us at least 10 years to get a transmission line designed and approved and finally constructed. And so that's an example where we need support from government to ease the deployment of all this investment across the economy and across infrastructure. Well, hopefully it gives you a little bit of a sense of the broader picture. In the meantime, our company is very engaged both through the Edison Energy side, helping other companies, with their pathways, and our utilities working on transportation and on building electrification through our programs. One last thought before I turn over to you, back to you, Neil, is this transition needs to work for everybody, and we cannot leave our low income and disadvantaged communities behind. So we've made sure that our programs are really addressing those communities. And for example, the $400+ million program we have for passenger vehicle charging, something like half of that program is targeted to our low income and disadvantaged customers. This needs to be a socially equitable transition. With that, hopefully it gives you a bit of an overview. And Neil, let me turn it back to you. I see there's some questions popping up.
Yeah, so we've got a few questions here. We've got a few minutes. So if other folks that are listening want to throw a question in, we might be able to get to a few more. Let's start right at the top here. To what extent does disinformation on renewable energy obstruct the successful realization of net zero goals for businesses like yours?
Yeah, that's a really important point. And to me, no better example than what happened with the Texas Storm Uri, right? You immediately saw a lot of narrative around this is all about renewables. And just even, I think a couple of days ago, I read yet another Wall Street Journal editorial that had the kind of narrative. When you take a look at the report that that NERC put out, the National Electric Reliability Corporation put out, they pointed to this having been a dramatic issue in terms of a major winter storm. And yes, renewables production declined, but the impacts to gas and coal were even larger. And a lot of this was about those generation stations not having prepared sufficiently for this. So this information hurts. And so it's important that, frankly, we rely on the academic community and the national labs to have a science, fact-based approach and get the real perspectives out there, because at the end of the day, this is about a lot of politics, and you're going to get a lot of alternative facts when you're dealing with politics.
Great. Okay. We've got a question here that's about net energy metering on distributed for solar for homeowners. I know that that's a topic of discussion with the Public Utilities Commission right now. So maybe you can at least talk a little bit about where that stands in terms of what's happening to the extent you're able to. But the question is more generally, does it make sense to try and, in a broadest sense of what it means for the electricity system, to try and encourage homeowners to go well over what would be a break-even solar capacity in order to be able to use that electricity for charging batteries or other things?
Yes. That's a great question. And it brings up, frankly, a hotly debated topic right now. You can't avoid it, right? So let me start by saying this. I gave you numbers earlier from our analysis, right? And those numbers said that we expect the state to add something like 30 gigawatts of distributed renewables. We see at least half of all rooftops in the state having solar by 2045. And you might ask, why not 100%? That would be great, but a lot of rooftops can't take it or are in places that don't have good direct solar access. But that needs to be a part of the solution. That said, we see electric load increasing by about 60% statewide. So you can't get there just on distributed renewables, and so that's where we saw 80 gigawatts of bulk power renewables needed. To get to the net energy metering issue, I believe that the appropriate incentives are needed and really valuable to get consumers to install solar. However, they need to be appropriate. And so just to get to the big debate right now on net energy metering, we have a program that started something like 15 years ago when solar costs were about 7 times higher than they are today. When that program started, the payback for a consumer who installed solar on their rooftop was around 10 or 11 years. And it's a 20-year revenue stream. So pretty attractive program, right? And we saw it be instrumental in getting California past its million solar rooftop mark. However, that program is paid for by non-solar customers, by everybody on the grid, right? And so today, the challenge that we have is that the incentive has gotten, I'll be blunt about it, way too rich. And the payback period now for a typical solar installation is 4 to 7 years on a 20-year program, which means that the rest of the customers are paying for at least 3 times over that initial investment. Moreover, we see a greater concentration of solar rooftop customers tending to be more affluent. Non-solar are less affluent in general. And today, the total amount being invested in this is a subsidy from non-solar to solar customers of $3.4 billion a year, going to about 1.2 million existing solar customers. Just to frame that for you, we also have low-income subsidies, low-income customer subsidies. Those in total for the state are actually about $1.4 billion a year for 2.8 million customers. So we're spending 3 times as much on the solar incentives as we are on helping low-income customers. And moreover, the price that we're paying for the solar electrons that are coming from a rooftop, it greatly exceeds the actual value of that electron if you go out and buy it in the market from bulk power resources. So, our view is that that program needs to be rationalized to be a fair incentive, considering it's a zero-sum game in terms of where the dollars come from. And the one final thing I'll say is that a lot of the narrative out there, maybe from some of the more activist type folks in the solar community, is that utilities are trying to get this reform to protect their profits. That's just not true. We don't make money by selling electrons. We make money by investing in the grid. And what we find is that solar installation gets greater value by being connected to a two-way grid, so that you can export your excess, that's the premise of the question, and have it be shared by everybody else in the grid. And we basically have the original sharing economy through the grid, and we need to make sure then that the incentives are at a fair level. Okay. A little long-winded, but it's a complicated topic now.
It is. Thank you. I'm going to try and jam in one more question, even though we're right up against time here. It says the wildfires in California have disrupted a lot of decarbonization plans. For instance, the EV charging programs, both from SCE, Charge Ready, and PG&E's similar program, getting delayed or canceled because of the challenges there. So can you just briefly describe what the situation is now and how we're going to move forward, since it seems likely that these sorts of extreme weather conditions are only going to intensify?
Sure. And thanks for the question. And part of the premise is correct. Look, the wildfires have been a huge impact. And frankly, we've seen climate change, along with development in high fire risk areas, contributing to a scale of fires since 2017 that we never imagined. The state has done a lot to mitigate that risk. We have as well. The investments we're making and hardening our infrastructure have already reduced the risk by 65 to 70% relative to 4 years ago. But to the other part of the question, we have actually not let the wildfire issue delay the deployment of electric vehicles or our programs. And this is, I frankly give a lot of credit, not just to our team, but credit to the Public Utilities Commission. We continue to put applications in front of them. We had our Charge Ready application that's mentioned in the question. That was, it got a little delayed, but not a lot. And it was approved by the commission in 2020, not only in the middle of the wildfire issues, but also in the middle of COVID, in the middle of the economic disruptions that that created for customers. Yet the commission said, look, this program is important to the clean energy transition. They trimmed our request a little bit, but they still approved the $436 million program. We've continued to make those installations. We've added our heavy duty version of the program. We since then, put in the building electrification application I mentioned. So we, I think, have succeeded in not letting the wildfire issue delay the deployment of electric vehicles and, frankly, the rest of the clean energy transition.
Great. Thank you so much, Pedro, for taking the time to talk with us about Edison and the plans you guys have and the view you have of California and the nation on decarbonization. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Neil. All of you, keep up the great work as we need you.